Were the pagan persecution by Christians harsher and more brutal than the early Christian persecution? That's the question we're going to answer in this video. I'm Quill of Inkhistory, and this video is part 2 in a series where we are comparing the early Christian persecution in Rome with the pagan persecution that took place following the Christianization of the Roman Empire, as well as put both persecutions into the greater religious and political context of the Roman Empire in antiquity, and through that gain a better understanding of the nature of the persecutions as well as their extent. If you haven't seen part 1 yet, make sure you do that before you keep watching. Otherwise, stay tuned. Following the conversion of Emperor Constantine and the Edict of Milan, the decade-long persecution initiated by Diocletian in 303 finally came to an end. Not only were Christians in Rome now tolerated by the authorities, but in addition did all future emperors, with only one exception, claim allegiance to the Christian god. As a result, the rate of pagans converting to Christianity started to increase exponentially, since it had now become less dangerous as well as more beneficial to convert to Christianity. This, however, did not mean that ancient paganism disappeared. Most people in the empire remained pagan until the beginning of the 5th century. In fact, the prominent historian of late antiquity, Peter Brown, have argued that polytheism remained prevalent on all levels of the Roman society, even into the 390s. However, as more people converted to Christianity, the empire started to see the emergence of emperors who were far more vocal and forceful in their religious views than Emperor Constantine had been. Just a few years after Constantine's death in 337 AD, his heir Constantius II laid several laws against pagan worship and practices. In 341, he declared that any citizen who performs a pagan sacrifice anywhere in the empire shall be put to the sword, and all their property be confiscated. In 346, he went on to declare that all pagan temples in all cities throughout the empire should be closed immediately, and all access to them be forbidden. This line of anti-pagan legislation was continued later in the century by Emperor Theodosius the Great, whom in year 381 AD made Christianity the official state religion of the empire. Early in his reign, he declared that any Christian who left the faith could not be able to pass on any worldly property to their heirs, and that any will of an apostate were to be nullified. In addition to this, he also passed laws forbidding pagan sacrifices and divination, and in 393 AD, he expanded the prohibition to officially outlawing the existence of pagan cults of any kind, even in the privacy of one's home. By the looks of it, it seemed that the late Roman Empire quickly became a dangerous environment for its pagan inhabitants. However, as with the early Christian persecution, one have to remember that what is declared on paper quite seldom reflected what usually happened on the ground. In order to understand the extent of the Christian persecution of pagans, it's necessary to get an understanding of how laws in the late Roman Empire worked. The way imperial laws in late antiquity usually originated was as a report or a statement of a situation somewhere in need of attention. Officials in the imperial consistory would then meet and frame a response to the situation, which then was submitted to the emperor for approval. If the response was approved, it would be sent to the praetorian prefects, who often added amendments and additions as they saw fit, and then distributed them to regional governors, who in turn could make their own additions and amendments to fit their local conditions. Finally, it was up to these local officials to decide whether to enforce the law or not, and as a result, what various laws and decrees said and what actually happened on the ground were often two very different things. In the historical record, this fact is clearly seen in how these kinds of anti-pagan legislations were repeated several times over the decades due to the emperors realizing that previous decrees had gone essentially unenforced. When the anti-pagan laws of Theodosius were passed, The majority of the empire consisted of pagans, whom for the most part were unaffected by them. However, one of course have to remember that though the pagan persecution by the Christian emperors were quite limited, there could still be instances of local sporadic persecution. In movies like Agora from 2009 and books like The Darkening Age by Catherine Nixie, late antiquity is depicted as a time when mobs of militant monks were roaming the streets of the empire, savagely destroying ancient temples and lynching pagan civilians in the streets. However, when one looks at the available archaeological records, these depictions are quickly called into question. In their book, The Archaeology of Late Antique Paganism from 2011, the scholars Luc Lavan and Michael Milrian covers a detailed collection of articles that survey the relevant evidence from across the Roman Empire in late antiquity. From all the evidence they have compiled, they confidently draw the conclusion that the destruction of pagan temples in late antiquity was a quite rare occurrence, with the rate of temples that were destroyed only being around 2 to 10% in most regions. What rather seemed to have happened to pagan temples is that as more and more people converted to Christianity, the financial sponsorship of pagan cults and temples from the state and nobility sharply declined. As a result, the ancient temples first saw dwindling numbers of visitors to eventually be closed by locals and later, much later, either being used as sources of building materials or converted to other uses. While it's true that there definitely were some instances of Christian violence which helped in the demise of the worship of the old gods, the marginalization of paganism were overall a natural process due to reasons such as indifference and a shift in people's priorities. That is not to say that paganism completely disappeared. As the scholar Edward G. Watts points out, pagan communities continue to exist in the Roman and Byzantine Empire well into the 5th, the 6th century and beyond. When comparing the early Christian persecution with the later pagan persecution by Christians, the main point I want to make is that for the most part, Christians and pagans were not that different from each other. While it's true that both Christians as well as pagan emperors were not hesitant to persecute people who did not subscribe to their faiths, for the most part, pagans and Christians got along peacefully alongside each other in everyday life. But as a scholar Bart Ehrman points out, do this sort of peace and quiet rarely make it into the history books. If you want to learn more about the history of early Christianity, as well as the persecution of Christians and pagans in antiquity, I strongly recommend you to pick up the book The Triumph of Christianity by Bart Ehrman. It can be found in most bigger libraries, and if you want to buy it, you can find it in the link in the description below. In this series, I hope you learn something new about the history of early Christian persecution, as well as about the history of later pagan persecution. And don't forget that if you like this video, smash that subscribe button and the bell icon so you don't miss anything.